President.
The senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, Donald Trump likes to call the bill that Republicans are trying to rush through this Senate the big, beautiful bill. Well, it's big, all right. It took the Senate clerk nearly 16 hours to speed read through it. But it is only beautiful if you're a billionaire or otherwise very wealthy in America. For everybody else, this is a big, ugly betrayal of a bill. Betrayal because tax cuts for billionaires are coming at the expense of virtually everyone else. Now, I agree with many of the things my colleague from North Carolina, Senator Tillis, just said. But I've also read the bill. And if you look at the bill, the tax benefits overwhelmingly go to the very highest income earners in the United States of America. 50% of those tax benefits go to just the top 5%. So this is a choice that is being made by Donald Trump and Republicans in Congress to give to billionaires additional tax handouts at the expense of the rest of the country. They are choosing to engage in a huge transfer of wealth from people who are working paycheck to paycheck to those who are living off their huge inheritances or gigantic stock portfolios. Now, Mr. President, Americans are going to have to pay for the tax cuts for billionaires in many, many ways. Millions will lose access to health care. Others will no longer be able to put food on the table. Others will not be able to afford to pay heating bills on freezing nights. Virtually every American will see their energy bills increase and their health insurance premiums go up. And every American is likely to face higher borrowing costs for their home mortgages or car loans. Again, also billionaires and very wealthy people can get big tax cuts. Let's look at some of the real hits to American families, starting with the attack on health care. Donald Trump said he would, quote, love and cherish Medicaid. He said the people won't be affected. That's a lie. What he loves are tax cuts for his billionaire buddies. So let's just take a look. This bill pays for over $1 trillion in tax giveaways to people who make over $500,000 every year by cutting $1 trillion of health benefits from those who rely on Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act. Think about that trade-off. Indeed, because of the cuts to Medicaid and the Affordable Care Act in this bill, 12 million Americans will lose access to health care coverage. On top of that, another 5 million Americans will lose access to health coverage because Republicans refuse to extend the tax credits that millions of middle-class Americans use to purchase coverage through the Affordable Care Act. So while extending tax cuts for the very wealthy, they are not extending the health care tax credits that middle-class Americans use to help afford health insurance. The result of these cuts and the refusal to extend those tax credits means that nearly 17 million of our fellow Americans will lose access to health care coverage. In my state of Maryland, that's 229,000 of my fellow Marylanders. And who are these Americans? Who are these Marylanders? They're babies and children. Medicaid and the Children's Health Insurance Program covers 38 million children in America, 700,000 children in Maryland. Medicaid covers 40% of births in America, over 40% of births in Maryland. More mothers will die during pregnancy-related deaths as a result of pregnancy-related deaths if this bill passes. I think we also know that Medicaid is especially important to helping people through the vulnerable stages of their lives. It covers 1 in 4 people with mental health or substance use disorders. It's the primary payer for long-term health services, covering 60% of nursing home residents. If even a fraction of those residents lose coverage, entire nursing homes can close. And those families will have to figure out how to care for their expelled loved ones. An analysis that was done estimates that as many as 500 healthcare or nursing homes could close because they're on the cusp. Rural hospitals are also especially vulnerable, and it's estimated that up to 300 rural hospitals could close if this bill passes. Americans with disabilities, Medicaid is absolutely essential to their lives. It helps them receive home and community-based care so they don't have to choose between getting the care they need and being separated from their loved ones. A study by Yale University and the University of Pennsylvania predicts that this bill, before the Senate, will result in over 51,000 preventable deaths each year. Preventable deaths. So officially, the death certificates will say that somebody passed away because they had late-stage cancer. It was detected too late, because they couldn't get the preventative care they needed. Or an accident occurred at a nursing home because there were not enough nurses on site. But those reasons, those conditions will have been set because this bill passed. And again, making millions of Americans more vulnerable to pay for tax cuts for the ultra-wealthy is unconscionable, but it is the choice being made in this bill. Now, 17 million people who will lose their health coverage is a very big number to wrap our heads around. So I want to read just a few stories of Marylanders who rely on Medicaid and who have been watching closely this whole effort that has unfolded on the floor of the United States Senate. I had a call from one of my constituents who has a son. Her son takes chemotherapy, and it relies on those chemotherapy treatments to sustain his life. She wrote to me that if he loses access to his health insurance, that it would be, quote, a death sentence. Another Marylander wrote to me about his autistic son, who is still able to work, but who depends entirely on Medicaid for support. He also said, please don't let the Senate pass this bill. And the stories go on and on and on. Just the other day, Senator Alsobrooks and I had a telephone town hall, had 12,000 Marylanders joining us. And after that call, we received many more stories about people who would really be in desperate shape if they lost access to their health coverage. Now, Mr. President, on top of the 17 million Americans who stand to lose their health coverage, all other Americans are likely to see higher premiums, because what happens when you have uncompensated care is more people go to the emergency rooms at the hospital, and those hospitals can't just eat all those additional costs. And at the end of the day, those additional costs cycle through the system in the form of higher premiums for others. And we are already seeing that impact in Maryland as insurance companies today look at the possible liability that they will have going forward as a result of this legislation. Now, beyond the 17 million who will lose access to affordable health care, you also have millions of Americans who are going to be hit as a result of the cuts to the food and nutrition programs, the SNAP programs. We're going to see a whopping 20% cut, $200 billion, to the SNAP program. Over 40 million Americans get some kind of help from that food and nutrition program, and over 3 million of them will lose their SNAP benefits entirely. Others will see rising costs. In Maryland, it's going to impact 684,000 people, most of whom are families with kids. Now, Mr. President, in addition to 17 million Americans losing access to health care coverage, in addition to the 40 million Americans who will be impacted by cuts to food and nutrition programs, I want to just focus for a moment on another hit to American households. Some of us have discussed it on this Senate floor before, but it hasn't gotten as much attention. And it relates to the energy bills Americans pay, including their electric bills, because this bill will drive them up because it directly attacks the production of more clean energy. And less energy with rising demand means higher costs for households. I don't know if folks remember about a year ago when Donald Trump had a steak dinner at Mar-a-Lago, where he begged 20 fossil fuel CEOs for campaign cash. It was reported on at the time. Well, he succeeded in raking in hundreds of millions of dollars in campaign donations, and now we see the payoff in this bill to those powerful special interests. And that payoff comes in two forms. First, this bill gives big oil companies a new $1 billion tax break. As a result, some of the fossil fuel companies will pay $0 in federal income tax. Second, this bill, and the senator from North Carolina referred to some of the provisions that will have this impact, this bill sabotages the production of more clean energy. It does so by slashing production and investment tax credits for clean energy and scuttling new clean energy projects. And it continues the Trump administration's baseless attacks on the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, a program we established that will be a win-win-win for our environment, for our economy, and for family pocketbooks. By cutting these clean energy incentives and initiatives, this bill will reduce the overall amount of energy added to our electric grids by at least 50% by 2035. Think about that. So this bill is going to result in a dramatic reduction in the amount of new energy produced that goes on the electric grids, and with less energy generated and higher demand, household energy costs and bills are going to go up. In fact, it's predicted that household electricity bills will go up by $110 on average as soon as next year, and by up to $400 per year for families over the next decade. This will serve the interests of big oil and gas producers and utility companies who benefit from the higher prices that consumers will have to shell out. This will also do something else, Mr. President. It will surrender entirely the clean energy playing field to China, who already has a big head start on us in the area of clean energy deployment. So this is not America first. This is very much America in retreat. I don't often agree with Elon Musk, but he is absolutely right when he said just a few days ago that, and I quote, "The latest Senate draft bill will destroy millions of jobs in America and cause immense strategic harm to our country. Utterly insane and destructive. It gives handouts to industries of the past while severely damaging industries of the future." That's the Republican Senate bill, looking in the rearview mirror rather than ahead. And again, what is the driving purpose? What's the North Star of this bill? To give very, very wealthy people tax cuts at the expense of everybody else. Everything else is sacrificed. As a result of those tax cuts, the top 0.1% highest income earners will get an average tax break of $255,000. Top 0.1% tax break of $255,000. Individuals making over $1 million a year will get a $35,000 tax break. And as I said earlier, almost 50% of all of the tax benefits, all the tax monies go to the top 5% of income earners. And to make that happen, as I've said, everything else gets sacrificed. Cuts to Medicaid, cuts to food and nutrition programs, cuts to clean energy that result in higher costs for consumers. But even after making all of those cuts and imposing all of that pain on so many Americans, this Republican bill is still going to add over $4 trillion to our deficit over the next 10 years, and an estimated $35 trillion over the next 30 years. So despite paying for part of those additional costs through cuts to Medicaid and food and nutrition programs, they're going to blow the roof off of our deficits and debt. And make no mistake, when you do that, you cost every American, because it will generate upward pressure on interest rates, which raises costs for Americans who want to take out a mortgage to buy a home, or want to get a car loan, or for small businesses. In fact, the Yale Budget Lab projects that the House-passed bill would add over $1,000 a year to the cost of a mortgage, and over $800 a year to the cost of a small business loan. That's the House-passed bill. The Senate bill will be worse, because the Senate bill is about $1 trillion more to the deficit over 10 years than the House bill. Now, Mr. President, I do want to just focus on a final aspect of the deficit and debt impact of the Senate Republican bill. And that is this very deliberate effort to use fraudulent accounting to hide the deficit impact of this bill from the American people. Let me give you an example. Let's say you signed a contract to rent an apartment for $2,000 a month. You know that's going to cost you $24,000 for the full year. Now, at the end of the year, if you want to keep renting that apartment at that rate, any normal person would say, well, that's going to cost them another $24,000. Senate Republicans want to tell the American people that the cost of continuing to rent that apartment for another year is zero, because the amount of rent they have to pay in year 2 is the same rent they had to pay in year 1. In other words, Republicans want to say that because they've been giving billionaires and wealthy people tax cuts for 10 years, it will cost nothing to extend them for another 10 years. That's the so-called, quote, current policy baseline. In other words, if you just keep in place for another 10 years the same tax breaks for billionaires and others, we don't have to count the lost revenue. And we don't have to count the amount the deficit will increase as a result of that lost revenue. Now, Mr. President, a third grader can see that this is bogus math. Let me read my colleagues a statement made this year by somebody, and I quote, "Anyone who says that about the," here's what he said, "anybody that says the current policy baseline is the way to go is engaging in intellectual and economic fraud, end of quote. I wanted to make sure I got that quote correct because it was made by a Republican congressman from Arizona, Congressman Schweihart. Here's another quote. This is fairy dust, and they are all full of crap, and I'm going to call them out on it. Who said that? Congressman Chip Roy, Republican from Texas. And I think it's worth quoting those Republican members of Congress because while I dramatically disagree with what they did in their House bill, at least they used honest accounting. At least they didn't try to perpetrate this budget fraud that we're witnessing here in the United States Senate. A budget fraud that would, I dare say, make the Enron scammers blush. And if you go through the numbers, it's dramatic. For example, honest scoring of the bill shows that extending the individual tax rates from Trump 2017 will cost $2.2 trillion. That's what the House of Representatives said, $2.2 trillion. When you use the fraudulent budget math that Senate Republicans want to use, all of a sudden that's $83 billion. If you look at the cost of extending key deductions for businesses, the House used accurate accounting. It comes to $820 billion over 10 years. Under the Senate plan, $6 billion. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time, Mr. President, going over this chart, but I do want to put it up here. This is from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. And the blue shade in each of these years shows what Senate Republicans say their bill will cost in each of those years. This is the so-called current policy baseline. This is what those House Republican members called fraudulent accounting, and it is. And if you add up all of those blue deficits over those 10 years, they claim it's $441 billion additional debt over 10 years. But if you use the honest accounting that we've always used in the United States Senate for the purpose of budget reconciliation, you get the full bar, including the orange numbers, which is $4.2 trillion in debt over those 10 years. I do want to point out to my colleagues something interesting because you have these dashed orange lines. What this is representing is that some of these costs from lost revenues in some of these out years go down. That's because under this House Republican plan, the tax cuts for people with the no tax on tips, they go away. They vanish. They vanish right here in 2029. But the tax cuts for very wealthy people, for billionaires and others, they go on for the 10 years. In fact, they go on forever. And the last point I'm going to make is by letting them go on forever, tax cuts for very wealthy people, Senate Republicans are violating the entire structure of the budget reconciliation process. Because when it was first devised, the entire purpose of it was to reduce our deficits and reduce the debt. And Republican senators are perverting the entire purpose of that special procedure that allows things to pass in the United States Senate with 51 votes and not having to secure the 60-vote threshold to overcome a filibuster. They are violating that entire structure. And again, why? Because they're hell-bent on making sure those tax cuts for very wealthy people go on forever. And again, at the expense of everybody else. And I'll just close, Mr. President, by pointing out that it wasn't that long ago that just down this hall here in the Senate Rotunda, Donald Trump took the oath of office. He looked at the cameras and he said he wanted a new golden age for America. But this is not a golden age for America. It is a gilded age for the wealthiest people in America. And those are the people he was really speaking to because they're the ones who were sitting right behind him on Inauguration Day. Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, Zuckerberg, the tech titans, the billionaire cabinet, more billionaires than any cabinet by far in American history. That's who this bill serves. It serves very wealthy and powerful people, and it does so at the expense of everybody else in America in one form or another. And I hope our Senate, on a bipartisan basis, will give it a big thumbs down, and I yield the floor.
Mr.